Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Tom Wells. I'm the Dean of Law School, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our 2019 Dewey Lecture. And we're delighted to welcome Stephen Lukes, Professor of Sociology from NYU, as this year's Dewey Lecture. But I'm not going to introduce him. In a moment, I'll introduce Brian Leiter, who will introduce him. I just want to say how appropriate it is for us to have a lecture today in law and philosophy. The law school, from its very founding, has been a place that's been dedicated to interdisciplinary scholarship and interdisciplinary learning. The law school was really founded on the idea that lawyers need to know more than just narrow legal doctrines, that a theoretical underpinning of law and lawmaking is important to produce the well-rounded lawyer. And the Dewey Lecture was founded nearly 30 years ago in honor, of course, of John Dewey. And Dewey, of course, had deep and many connections to the University of Chicago. He was chair of the university's philosophy department for over a decade. And while he was here, his intellectual work really helped launch the Chicago School of Pragmatism, which is one of the most prominent and influential intellectual movements of the late 19th and early 20th century. And I also am quick to point out that while he was here, Dewey also created the Universities of Chicago's Laboratory School, at which many of our faculty's children are educated. And since 1981, we have had the Dewey Lecture. The Dewey Lecture was created when our then Dean, Gerhard Casper, decided that the law school should recognize Dewey's ties to the university and, in particular, his contributions to legal theory. And so he corresponded with philosopher Sidney Hook, who was then president of the John Dewey Foundation, about establishing the lectureship. And Hook readily agreed to Dean Casper's suggestion of the Dewey Lectureship in jurisprudence. And in so doing, Hook wrote back to Dean Casper about Dewey and said the following: that Dewey's association with the University of Chicago was so central to his philosophical career and so fruitful for the many disciplines that it is a source of particular gratification for the foundation to help establish this lectureship. And since its founding, the Dewey Lectureship has had an illustrious history here at the law school. To give just one example, John Rawls's famous paper, The Idea of Public Reason Revisited, was itself a Dewey Lecture and published in our University of Chicago Law Review. And many esteemed philosophers have delivered this lecture, including Amartya Sen, Ronald Dworkin, Richard Rorty, Hilary Putnam, Peter Singer, Catherine McKinnon, our own Martha Nussbaum, and we're delighted to add to that distinguished list today with Professor Stephen Lukes. And to introduce him, it's my pleasure to introduce our colleague, Professor Brian Leiter. Brian is the Carl N. Llewellyn Professor of Jurisprudence. He is also the director of the Center for Law, Philosophy, and Human Values. Now, all of us at the law school know Brian's research and teaching are in moral, political, and legal theory, both in the Anglophone and continental European traditions. And of course, he is also a very popular professor and teacher of the law of evidence. He's author of numerous articles in both law reviews and philosophical journals. He's the author of numerous books, including most recently, Why Tolerate Religion and Nietzsche on Morality. So welcome to our 2019 Dewey Lecture, and please join me in welcoming Professor Leiter.
Well, it is my great pleasure to introduce this year's Dewey Lecturer, Stephen Lukes, whose wide-ranging work over the last 45 years has been tremendously influential in sociology, in social and political theory, and in philosophy. A look at just some of his academic positions over the years is testimony to his cross-disciplinary approach. He was fellow and tutor in politics and sociology at Balliol College, Oxford, for more than 20 years. Then professor of political and social theory at the European University Institute in Florence. Subsequently professor of moral philosophy at the University of Siena, also in Italy. And for the last 20 years, professor of sociology at New York University. In 1987, he was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in the section of the Academy recognizing distinguished contributions to political studies. In the early and mid-1970s, Professor Lukes produced 3 monographs in quick succession. First, his classic study of Emile Durkheim, his life and work. Second, the book Individualism, an examination of differing conceptions of it throughout history. And then the hugely influential Power, A Radical View, which will be coming out in a 3rd edition in the near future. Now, in this last work, Lukes famously argues there are 3 kinds of power social actors can exercise. Overt power consists in the ability to prevail over others in the face of conflict in decision-making situations. By contrast, covert power consists in setting the agenda, in controlling what is even allowed to become a topic for decision-making. The 3rd kind of power, however, is the most insidious and the most hidden from view. It is the power to shape desires and beliefs, to influence people's wishes and thoughts, leading people to make fundamental mistakes about their real interests. That last kind of power, of course, resonates with the Marxian ideas about false consciousness and ideological delusion. In the late 70s and 80s, there was a flourishing of analytically rigorous work by Anglophone scholars on Marx's ideas. Professor Lukes' seminal contribution to this revival of interest in Marx was his 1985's Marxism and Morality, in which he aimed to resolve the apparent paradox that, on the one hand, Marxism seems to dismiss morality and moral talk as perniciously ideological, obscuring the exercise of power by the dominant economic class, and yet at the same time makes moral judgments of his own all the time. We were fortunate that Professor Lukes discussed this work with us at the Law and Philosophy Workshop this past Monday. Also in the 1980s, Professor Lukes edited with the philosopher Martin Hollis a famous collection of essays on rationality and relativism, to which he also contributed. It was, in fact, the first book of his I bought, when I was an undergraduate, no less. Relativism has been an ongoing concern in his work, manifest, for example, in his 2003 collection, delightfully titled Liberals and Cannibals, The Implications of Diversity, and his 2008 book on moral relativism, as well as his writing to the present day on what we might call the sociology of morality. In 1995, Professor Lukes turned his hand to fiction, in particular political and intellectual satire, with The Curious Enlightenment of Professor Caritat, a book now translated into more than a dozen languages around the world, from Portuguese to Thai. A review of the book from Publishers Weekly gives a sense for why it has proved so popular with readers around the world, so let me share that. Not many pages into the book, its hero, Professor Nicolas Caritat, a prominent scholar of the Enlightenment, is given the nickname Dr. Pangloss. Having been arrested by the military junta of the country Militaria, on the grounds that his work foments optimism, Caritat has just been sprung from jail by members of the Visible Hand, a guerrilla group. The Hand gives him a mission. He must find, quote, grounds for optimism and, quote, the best possible world. Caritat visits a string of countries, not to be found in our atlases, that are founded on or warped by various political philosophies. A citizen of the country Utilitaria informs him that, quote, a high suicide rate, provided the suicides are appropriately distributed, can make a real contribution to the overall sum of happiness. In the laissez-faire paradise of Libertaria, it isn't long before Caritat finds himself on the street with the homeless. Lukes, says Publishers Weekly, writes with great humor and confidence as the insouciant Caritat is buffeted from one false utopia to the next. Toward the end, Caritat gets the point and expresses his distrust of utopias in a moving letter to his children, part of which reads, "Another thing I have noticed is that everyone I have met so far seems to have stopped learning. They seem as if trapped in their language and their world and quite closed to one another's." Well, my all too brief overview of just some of Professor Lukes' work makes clear he is plainly not someone who has stopped learning, and he remains open to many different worlds, modeled throughout his writings by his generous and intelligent engagement with multiple disciplines that can shed light on our social, political, and moral lives. Today, Professor Lukes will talk to us about power, truth, and politics. So please join me in welcoming Stephen Lukes as the 2019 Dewey Lecturer in Law and Philosophy.
What a delightful introduction. Thank you so much. You're very welcome. I'm inclined to tell a little story just since you were kind enough to mention my novel, satirical novel about Professor Caritat traveling to imaginary worlds. I remember that I gave this lecture in Oxford, and John Rawls, one of your previous Dewey lecturers, was present. And one of the things you didn't mention, Brown, is that at the end of the novel, end of the story, Professor Caritat is still in search of the best possible world. And he's in search of egalitarian, of which I say very little in the novel. But John Rawls, who was present at the lecture, came up to me afterwards and he said, "That was a very interesting lecture, but I'd like to know more about egalitarian." And I said to him, "So would I." So it's such a pleasure to be here and such an honor. But I'm going to, after thanking you, which I do warmly, I'm going to leap straight into the topic, which is certainly Deweyan in its theme, though not necessarily in its argumentation. I had asked, there was to be, but it doesn't matter, Brian, if you're worried about there were a couple of sentences I wanted to have, as it were, available to you to read. And I'm going to read them out, and I'm just going to ask you to remember them, because they form, so to speak, the text of what I want to talk about. The first, they're both from Hannah Arendt, and the sentences are these, just two, from her famous essay, Truth in Politics. And the first sentence is this: "No one ever doubted that truth and politics are on rather bad terms with each other." That was the first sentence. The second sentence is a question. And the second sentence is the question: is it in the very essence of truth to be impotent, and in the very essence of power to be deceitful? So those two questions are basically what form, so to speak, the frame of what I want to try to explore today with you. So just taking that second question about the essence of truth and being impotent and the essence of power being deceitful, rather than discussing what is to me an obscure question, namely what the essence of power and the essence of truth might possibly be, I propose that we examine instead several more specific questions, namely in what ways truth might be deceitful and in what ways truths might be impotent, and in what ways power may be deceitful. That's to say, and in particular, a more specific question: how can power render truth impotent? And why these questions are acute in a special way within politics. Hence my title, Power, Truth, and Politics. These seem to be especially so, these problems arise especially acutely in present-day politics, here in the United States and elsewhere. And so I'm going to conclude by asking why that might be. So let's start with truth. Now, truths, of course, come in all shapes and sizes, and these range from statements of straightforwardly brute facts, like, for example, who won the popular vote, to truths involving interpretations of meaning and motive, such as, for example, deciding whether there was collusion with Russia in the 2016 election. Ranging from those sorts of questions or truths to scientifically warranted claims, such as those concerning, for instance, the extent and causes of climate change, and then to further, even more wide-ranging and complicated truths, like, for instance, the extent of inequality in a society or whatever. Then, of course, there are what Gilles Lepore calls these truths, the title of her recent historical book, regarding political equality, natural rights, and the sovereignty of the people, which Jefferson wanted to call sacred and inviolable truths, that was overruled by Franklin, who called them self-evident. There were, of course, also claims to truth, where the very question of whether they can be true or false is in question. And some doubt, or used to, that moral judgments are capable of truth, and others that metaphysical or ontological statements, such as Mrs. Thatcher's famous statement that there's no such thing as society, whether they can be thought of as true. Now, the trouble becomes, can you hear me all right? I suddenly realized, is it all clear? Yes. I want to say this. The truths become impotent when they fail to register. That's to say, when they're ignored or rejected, or when recognized, they fail to guide action. When this happens, there are two kinds of explanation. One is psychological, and so that one can bring this first kind of failure, one can think of psychological failures as failures of rationality. That's to say, the topic that's been intensively and extensively studied by cognitive scientists and behavioral scientists, for example, wishful thinking and the like. Now, the explanation here, where the explanation is psychological, where it's a question of internal problems, this is typically in terms of mechanisms that are internal to individuals taken severally, or indeed people taken interactively, as in the case of group thinking. Or secondly, there are external explanations rather than internal ones. That's to say, in terms of the impact, direct or indirect, of others on how people view facts and issues. As, for example, how they're framed by politicians, teachers, journalists, intellectuals, and opinion leaders of all kinds. Now, these two kinds of explanations, internal and external, are obviously not mutually exclusive. External actors can, deliberately or not, and whether by acting or merely existing, activate and reinforce the psychological mechanisms that conceal or distort or render inoperative truths that would otherwise be seen, accepted as true, and acted upon. So truths can be impotent, and the causes of that impotence can be internal or external, or very likely both. But as George Orwell warned, what is proclaimed to be truth can also be all too potent. People across an entire society can be brought to accept, or at least not contest, official truths that shape their world. In totalitarian regimes, he wrote, what is claimed to be objective truth can control the past as well as the future. And I'm reminded of that old Soviet joke that the future is certain, it's only the past that's unpredictable. This relation of truth and power in politics dominated much of the 20th century. Also, of course, preoccupied Hannah Arendt. But in the essay from which I've quoted, with the two sentences with which I began, she focuses rather on the way in which truth in politics is always perspectival, and a question of a matter of the entanglement of opinion and belief. And it successfully transmitted and acknowledged, and whether this, how this happens depends upon what she calls with free agreement and consent with which she is preoccupied in a well-functioning politics. Now, what this illustrates is an important point that Bernard Williams once made, that effective methods of discovering or transmitting truths will depend on the kinds of truth in question. So, in various different domains, and I'm going to focus on this, in various different domains of life, informal norms and institutional rules and procedures operate to control the effects of partisanship, and in general to counter the role of interests in propagating, distorting, concealing, or interpreting the message. So we can call these practices of truth, governed, that is, by norms, rules, and procedures, the point of which is to enable and constrain what counts as reasoning in the relevant domains. So, for instance, in science, in journalism, I'm going to take these four, in science, in journalism, in the legal system, and in public administration, In all these four institutional spheres, we could talk about others, but I'm going to focus on them, there are distinctive, recognized, professionally sanctioned norms, rules, and procedures, violations of which may be less or more serious, ranging from occasional lapses to malpractice. They are all distinctive ways of securing and maintaining trust within the relevant communities. And they consist in distinctive ways of grounding results, scientific theories, journalistic stories, legal verdicts, administrative decisions, on properly acquired evidence and limiting and ideally avoiding falsification, fraud, and corruption. So much for truth. Now power. Going to be a bit telegraphic here, but try to say what I want. Power. Why should anyone think that power, as Arendt put it, is inherently deceitful? Michel Foucault thought this. He said, for instance, power is tolerable only on condition that it masks a substantial part of itself. Wendy Brown, in a recent book, similarly says that power must deflect from the operations and fashion itself as non-power. In other words, Foucault and Brown are both saying power is self-conceding if it's going to be effective. Norms, in particular, Wendy Brown says, govern precisely by seeming to be unrelated to power, but they are generated by power and operate as power. And she has in mind, in particular, gender and sexuality norms and so on. But this is what both Foucault and Wendy Brown are saying. Now, I think we need to do a bit of conceptual house cleaning here, because at its most general, I mean, we have to, in other words, say what we mean by it. At the most general, it's really quite banal. It just means the capacity to influence outcomes, whatever they may be. More specifically, in the context of social relations, the capacity to influence significant social outcomes, whether positively or negatively. But let's be more precise. Let's say that power, for the purposes at hand, is the capacity to secure the compliance of others, of another or others. So let's say that's what power is. Now, what Arendt, Foucault, and Wendy Brown are up to is they're focusing, however, on the yet more specific concept of power as an asymmetric relationship. That is to say, where the powerful, what they have over another, what they do is they get them, when they exercise that power, to act or think or both in a way that is against their interests and accords with the interests of those with power. Now, what's significant here and relevant to Hannah Arendt's claim is the suggestion that when power, thus conceived, is successful, that's because the compliance is secured in conditions that put in question the freely given consent of the person or persons subject to it. That's her idea. The compliance may be induced by confronting people with an unfavorable set of options, or it may result from the process or mechanism by which it's brought about, or by previous history of injustice. But the point being is that the compliance may be unwilling or willing. But if it's willing, it must be under circumstances that prevent or impede adequate judgment in the light of the relevant evidence or facts. So let's call that power, now more specific still, domination. Domination can be, and very often is, coercive. And in that case, it involves threats. But it could also be a matter of me making you an offer you can't refuse. Or it could indeed be something like coercive inducement, where not making or withdrawing or threatening to withdraw an offer would represent a significant loss. The increasingly numerous cases of sexual harassment that we've been hearing about illustrate the various ways in which that can happen. Submitting where the less powerful submit to the will of the powerful. And here, of course, there need be no deceit. But domination will be less coercive or non-coercive. It won't involve the threat or a negative sanction, to the extent that people are willingly accepting that those who are more powerful should prevail. So this leads us, I think, to consider the various ways in which that willingness can come about. Securing others' compliance may, of course, be non-dominating, and you can advance other people's interests in a domination-free situation. But power and domination occurs where, to the extent that compliance is brought about and sustained by the powerful, where, for example, and Brad has very helpfully gone through the various possibilities. It can be controlling the agenda, and it can be what has been called mobilizing the bias of a situation, or it can be in actually voluntary compliance to domination. May not even require any kind of manipulation, or it could just involve habituation, loyalty, deference, and so on. These are all alternative ways in which, whether through acting or even not acting, compliance is secured. Now, finally, we've reached the topic before us. Sorry about the long labyrinthine way, but here we are. The question is, in what ways can power render truth impotent? And it needn't be by deceit, of course. That's my claim. But how can it happen? It can happen in several ways. Power can be a danger to truth in various domains of life. And I'm coming now back to the four domains I mentioned: science, journalism, the law, public administration. These are all spheres of collective reasoning, I claim. That is, the practices in each, ideally at least, involve arriving at results guided by reasons where the results are such that the participants agree in taking them to be justified as true in the light of evidence and reason. These practices are endangered from within and without, and they're protected from these dangers by formal and informal norms, so that the reasoning can proceed as it should. External dangers threaten the boundaries of the practices, and as these are, and also, so these are then police the boundaries. For example, what counts as scientific theorizing is continually in question, notably in the so-called debate between evolutionary theory and intelligent design. For example, journalism is threatened from without. In many places, journalists at work and live in danger of their lives. These days in the United States, they have to deal not only with politically motivated assaults as purveyors of fake news, but also as their jobs and opportunities fall away with the proliferation in social media of untrained and inexperienced citizen journalists. In the law, there is a constant question of how to maintain the principle, some say fiction, at least, of the public's belief that legal reasoning and decision-making by judges from the Supreme Court down are autonomous, governed by precedent and statute, rather than interfered with by politics. And there's the question about the relationship between the law and religion, and the law and morality. These boundaries are constantly having to be policed. And similarly, in public administration, rational bureaucratic practice must be protected from arbitrary interference, so that there's a line to be maintained between public and private. Officials in government agencies must interpret the missions of their institutions, typically framed in terms of public goods, education, protecting the environment, and the consumer, and whatever. In sum, in a well-functioning democratic society, there are settled answers to these questions, establishing boundaries around the practices in question. Moreover, the dangers to these truth-seeking practices from within, I've just been so far talking about the dangers from without and the need to police these boundaries. From within, the dangers have to do with participants violating the respective values and norms of those domains. And in these cases, 4 cases, there is rivalry always among, for example, scientists engaging in scientific research teams competing for grants, for instance. Journalists compete for work and recognition. Professional lawyers compete for clients and promotion. And state agencies compete for resources. The point being, however, that when appropriately regulated, these practices should function against the background of mutual trust, respect, and cooperation. Science, journalism, the law and public administration function within what sociologists following Pierre Bourdieu call fields. That's what Bourdieu means by a field. That is to say, social spaces within which actors mutually recognize one another within communities with regard to professional or specialized practices and shared assumptions, in which they compete for what in each field counts as success in realizing shared value, or as Bourdieu calls it, symbolic capital, in ways that are enabled and constrained by shared norms. And scientists and journalists aim at, so here, just to indicate more specifically, scientists and journalists, they both aim in different ways at what they respectively call objectivity, as they respectively interpret it. Lawyers aim at implementing the rule of law, public administrators at providing and protecting public goods. But in all four cases, they have a professional interest in securing recognition by winning, but the point being that they have to win by the rules of their respective games. They can't succeed in these different ways by resorting to any means, by ignoring or changing the rules, that is, by aiming directly, no holds barred, at outcomes come what may. What matters is that their activities should lead to outcomes that are justified by evidence properly acquired and adequately interpreted and communicated according to the relevant professional community standards. The norms in each case in these various fields, for example, replication in science, fact-checking in journalism, adversary system in Anglo-American criminal law, bureaucratic rules and public consultation administration, those are examples. These are filters, so to speak, designed to help to ensure what I've just said, ensure it by ruling out arbitrariness, idiosyncrasy, incompetence, favoritism, nepotism, negligence, subterfuge, skullduggery, malpractice, fraud, and corruption. They function to restrict the power of interest-driven parties to render truth impotent. Now, question, are they, in purporting to do so, deceitful? I want to return to this point, to Wendy Brown's view that I mentioned briefly before, that they are, she thinks they are. She thinks, in other words, that norms govern precisely by seeming to be unrelated to power, but are generated by power and operate as power. That's what she says. Well, that view, which is very Foucault-like view, in my view, this view, whose point is to denaturalize norms of, for instance, gender and sexuality, unmasking them as patriarchal instincts, is, when generalized, I think unhelpfully undiscriminated. It only appears plausible if we're taking power in its completely generic, symmetrical sense of the ability to secure compliance for good or ill. Norms involve power in this sense, obviously, in this very broad sense. But if they're to function, because they have to, they involve power in this very general sense because they have to be enforced and policed. But in the asymmetric sense of dominating power that we're now using, the truth-tracking norms I have just been considering, science, journalism, the law, and public administration, they're in a different category. Because if functioning well, as they should, and though permanently liable, of course, to abuse, which can even, as in the law, be serious and systematic for the vulnerable, these norms are needed for both protection and detection. They are there to protect against dominating power and to detect its many manifestations. Now I come, having talked about truth and power and the way in which power can render truth impotent, to politics. We can now begin to see, I think, why it is, if politics is a field in Bourdieu's sense, it is distinctive politics from these other fields in a way that renders plausible Hannah Arendt's claim that political power and truth are on rather bad terms, self-bestowed versus center. Though I'm going to suggest how bad these terms will be will depend on two broad conditions. In the light of the fields I've so far discussed, science, journalism, law, and public administration, we can surmise that the prospects for truth in politics depends on how political partisanship works. The prospects will be rather better under two conditions. The first is that there are institutional rules and procedures and informal norms that the following of which tends to track truth and are generally recognized by participants both within and outside the relevant fields as legitimate. Specifically, that means that political actors and institutions be responsive to evidence-based results of science, journalism, and the law and public administration. In other words, the very fields I've been talking about have to be operating well and respected politically. And it also has to be the case that these institutions are largely autonomous, that is, independent of political interference and of extraneous personal, factional, and economic interests. It would also require, among other things, standard equal rights, freedoms of speech and association, and so on, contested elections, fair representation of interests and opinions, and other such constitutionally liberal things, and an active civil sphere. But the second condition that I think is crucial here is that citizens actually recognize one another as participating in the same set of practices. That is, following agreed rules and procedures as forming a single, all-encompassing unity or citizenry, despite what may divide them, whatever it may in fact be dividing them. So here's the question. Is that true of politics? That is to say, is it true that there is a common area of trust and a basis for functioning truth-tracking institutions? The question isn't whether a given set of presuppositions are accepted and what's taken as common ground by adversaries, or even what the game is that all are participating in. The question is, to what extent is that at work? And here's my thought. It seems to me that question is itself a political question. It is self-evident that politics can't be understood as functioning only under the favorable truth-favoring conditions I just mentioned. Some would say ideal conditions. Nor is it obvious that politics is what is widely understood as democratic in well-functioning democracies. We have to, in other words, see the political field is different in the sense that the question of what the game is that people are playing is itself a political question. I want to distinguish between two kinds of view about this. On the one hand, you have so-called self-described realists. According to realists, these conditions, the ideal conditions that under which politics would be a field in which the favorable conditions are at work, is so distant from actual conditions of political life that they're even irrelevant to an understanding of what the practice of politics, even democratic politics, really amounts to. Realists argue that to view politics in the light of its ideal functioning as more or less distant from it, but seeing it through the lens of ideal politics, is misconceived. Rather, they say that we should start from the other end, so to speak, from Hobbes rather than from Rousseau, from Carl Schmitt rather than from Jürgen Habermas. So let's say that there are two views of politics. We could call it the agonistic view and the deliberative view. Chantal Mouffe proposes a view of democratic politics as from a rather hard-headed, you might say, Schmittian realist view. She thinks of democratic politics as what she calls agonistic pluralism, where agonistic signifies ineliminable antagonism, which is tamed, however, or sublimated. Antagonism, she writes, is struggle between enemies, while agonism is struggle between adversaries. There may be shared adhesion to the principles of liberal democracy, to liberty and equality, but no agreement as to their meaning and implementation, certainly none that could be reached through deliberation and rational discussion. The most to be hoped for is compromise. Compromise is seen as temporary respites in an ongoing confrontation. So on this view, politics is all about taking sides, affirming commitments with passion and solidarity, and making decisions, including decisions about what it's reasonable to believe and thus count as true. So it's not an accident that recently she has argued in very strong terms for what she calls left-wing populism, to confront the right-wing populism that we're living with. Now the contrasting view we'll call the deliberative view, and I think you find this among other people in Hannah Arendt, but also in Habermas and Rawls. And here, what we can say is the central idea is this rejects the idea of deep, irreconcilable, intransigent, intractable disagreement, taking politics rather to be a mutual enterprise of justification and reasoning and deliberation. Now, the deliberative model, elaborated by political theorists, I wouldn't go into it because I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but this idea, elaborated by political theorists, finds a home or counterpart in what political scientists Bartels and Bacon, in their deflationary recent book, Democracy for Realists, call the folk theory of democracy, that has, as they put it, passed into everyday wisdom, not just in the United States, but in a great many other countries, according to which democracy makes the people the rulers of legitimacy derives from their consent, and which often simply assumes rationality and neutral consideration, the patient exchange of publicly justified reasons for supporting public policies. Realists, they maintain, acknowledge that identity is politically powerful in ways that the folk theory of democracy, which is the one they are criticizing here, obscures or ignores. And they go so far as to claim that even the most attentive citizens mostly adopt the policy positions of their party, of their political parties, as their own. They are mirrors of their parties, not their masters. Well, unlike the other fields considered, science, journalism, the law, and public administration, in politics we can't, or perhaps can no longer, assume a settled consensus in which people mutually identifying with one another agree about what the game that they're participating is, where the boundaries of politics lie, and what norms should govern its practice. And as I shall now suggest, we may also conclude that trouble, maybe very serious trouble, is in store for truth when, to use Chantal Mouffe's distinction, agonism morphs into antagonism. That is to say, when adversaries become enemies, where there is, that is, adherence of the relatively safe, zero-sum agonistic view of politics and their friends, those adherents come to view the very deliberative view itself, as the social practices that embody it, and its adherents, no longer as adversaries, but as their enemies. So now I just want to come to a little bit of history, which is in our memories. In November 2009, Rush Limbaugh, when discussing something that was called Climategate on his radio program, which was in fact a manufactured controversy in which scientists at the Research Institute who were falsely accused on right-wing media of conspiring to manipulate results by global warming, he said this, Rush Limbaugh: scientists are bought and paid for by the left I'm quoting now from Limbaugh. He said, what this fraud, what this uncovering of this hoax, remember, it wasn't a hoax, exposes, is the corruption that exists between government and academia and science, and the media. Science has been corrupted. We know the media has been corrupted. We know the media has been corrupted for a long time. Academia has been corrupted. None of what they say is real. It's all lies. He called these institutions, that is to say, government, academia, science, and the media, the four corners of deceit. And he then went on to say that he and his listeners lived in a world apart. We live in two universes, he said. Our universe, one universe is a lie. One universe is an entire lie. Everything run, dominated, and controlled by the left, here and around the world, is a lie. The other universe is where we are, and that's where reality reigns supreme, and we deal with it. And seldom do these two universes even overlap. Now, notice that this was 7 years before the election of President Trump. It's since become entirely normal for media figures like Limbaugh and Fox News, and of course the president himself, to denounce in the same Manichaean terms the press as the enemy of the people, purveying fake news, all of TV journalism apart from Fox News, climate science, judges, the leadership of the Department of Justice and the Mueller investigation, and even the government's own intelligence agencies, and to attack several of its other agencies by subverting their missions by appointing as their heads and personnel people against their very mission, in pursuit, in general, Steve Bannon's project of deconstructing the image state. What is loosely called polarization, and I want to have a moment at the end of my lecture to say something about polarization, if I give myself time. What is loosely called polarization has taken the form of one side denouncing and attacking entire institutions as taken over by an enemy seen as unified. So, in a book by Grossman and Hopkins called Asymmetric Politics, Ideological Republicans and Group Interest Democrats, they write of an informal information polarization as having its source in the American conservative movement's decades-long battle against institutions that it is deemed irredeemably liberal. Furthermore, the very practice of truth-telling has been put in jeopardy at the highest level of government, not by merely lying, as in previous administrations, notably the second Bush administration, but by bullshitting, defined so elegantly by the philosopher Henry Frankfurt as an indifference to the very practice of truth. And the many millions of supporters of the president and the governing party, the bullshittees, so to speak, either believe or are unaware of or indifferent to, indeed find enjoyment in, even admire the bravado of an unceasing flow of untruths and inconsistency. Research by Sanford Schramm and Richard Fordley has shown that relying on Fox News and believing fake news relative to real news are strongly associated with each other and with supporting Trump in the 2016 election. So how should we understand these developments? No longer, I suggest, in traditional terms, as Rush Limbaugh's words suggest, of left and right, nor, as he constantly does, using the language of silos, as we constantly do, and often do, talking about silos and bubbles and echo chambers and the rest, in which we live our lives tribally. In other words, the idea that somehow this is a problem we're all facing. For these various metaphors suggest symmetry. Left and right are in the same level, on the same level of spectrum, poles in a single force field, each requiring the other for the very distinction to apply of left and right. And the other metaphors also suggest that we're all equally and similarly entrenched or enclosed or separated from one another, living our lives in separate and uncommunicating social and political worlds, which of course was the limbo picture. We need, I think, rather to take the measure of the growing asymmetry of present-day political life in the United States today and elsewhere. What we're seeing, one might say, is a developing political struggle that is in part, if you like, a struggle between the promotion of credulity and the survival of credibility. So people can be impervious to truth and consistency because they hold false and inconsistent beliefs. But we can also be indifferent to truth and consistency, and likewise in different ways. But what we've got here, I think, is a struggle still in its early stages, a kind of meta-political struggle, not within but about the very field of politics, about its boundaries and constitutive institutions and norms. Here's what the journalist David Roberts has to say about this, and I very strongly agree with this way of thinking. He says, on one side, what we have is what we might call the classic liberal democratic, small l, small d, theory of politics. And in this view, politics is a kind of structured contest. Factions and parties battle over interests and policies, but the field of play on which they battle is ring-fenced by a set of common institutions and norms, and inside that fence is normal politics, the subject of legitimate political debate, and outside that fence is out of bounds in violation of shared standards. But equally, what we might call the game of politics is defined by explicit rules. So thus, it's defined by explicit rules. For instance, the Constitution, or enforced by various legally empowered referees, courts, executive branch. But it's also defined by implicit norms, written, unwritten rules, more informally enforced by the press, academia, and civil society. And these latter institutions are referees as well. But their enforcement power operates not through law, but through trust. Their transpartisan authority exists solely because participants in the game agree that it does. So, in present-day US politics, and elsewhere, and I mean, we could be talking about actually Britain, in the context of Brexit, which has been touching me very deeply over the last months, I must tell you. Poland, Hungary, I mean, places, in other words, where that agreement is becoming less and less secure. Democrats, large D, in America, are by and large still in that game, in the game that involves trust and the respect of the norms operating within the fields I talked about. But large swaths of the Republican Party's office holders and many millions of their voters are not. I have to say, having spent this morning watching the congressional interrogation of Michael Cohen, it became very, very visible to me. It was very clear the way in which this has now infected the Republican Party in the House and of course in the Senate. Large swaths of Republican Party office holders and millions of their voters are not participants in the game as it can be understood. That is to say, the game itself, its institutions and norms are increasingly under attack. And our normal inherited political vocabulary, populism, authoritarianism, I think is inadequate to capture this development. Bourdieu, for example, recalls that the anti-parliamentary, anti-democratic language of fascist or quasi-fascist parties, according to which membership in the same political field was viewed as complicity in a kind of corrupt game. But now I think the present threat is, in a sense, even more worrying because it's intra-democratic. It operates from within that game. It doesn't come from enmity to parliamentarism and democracy, as was the case with fascism. So the talk of fascism is not only historically but descriptively inaccurate. What we are seeing, I think, is subversion from within that consists in discrediting the various institutions and practices whose game is arriving at conclusions based on evidence, on collective reasoning and tracking of truth. Which raises the important, as it were, practical political question for Democrats. Should the Democratic Party go on to a walk footing? Should it abandon the Obama disposition, we might call it, that derives from his concept of politics, to trust or perhaps hope that Democrats face not enemies but adversaries? Wouldn't doing so amount to forsaking the very point, I'm asking, of being a Democrat, large D, and indeed small d? So I have some more to say, but I did promise myself and Brian that I really wouldn't go beyond 50 minutes. And I think we probably, how much more time do you think I should allow myself? Another 5 or 10? Is that all right?
5 more.
Right. 5. I want to conclude with 2 thoughts. I mean, it does all raise the question, how did we get here? And who's responsible? Or rather, who or what is responsible? If you accept my, as it were, description. One question, which I'd like to go into, and maybe we could in the discussion, is what role have intellectuals played in all of this? To what extent is all this the fault of intellectuals who put the truth, or thoughts about the truth, or talk about the truth, into question? What role have thinkers played in destabilizing, even undermining, the very idea of objectivity? Should we include them among the sources of truth? What the Rand Corporation, in a very interesting recent report, is called Truth Decay. I don't actually think it's so great as an analysis. The concept's pretty good though. I mean, they have noticed that there's something called truth decay that's been happening, and they offer a whole range of reasons and accounts of what it is about. But my question right now is, to what extent are intellectuals seriously to be thought of as responsible? Have they contributed to rendering truths impotent in public life? Are postmodernism, Rortian irony about truth, loose talk about social construction, so-called science laws, to what extent are they part of the story? Well, I think I'm going to just leave this as a question. I mean, that's not been the topic of my lecture, but I have to say, I do think there's something to be said for a comment that Steven Weinberg, the physicist, made, which is, I never heard anything remotely postmodern from a member of Congress. I think the forces against taking climate change seriously are overwhelmingly economic. It's like the question of whether tobacco smoke is bad for you, or whether sugary sodas are bad for you. All these things are posed by people who have a financial stake. It's got nothing to do with the science wars. I mean, we should bear that in mind. Nevertheless, I mean, there are intellectuals who have, as it were, registered alarm at the import of what they've been saying. So Bruno Latour, for example, who was a major force in the science wars in destabilizing thought about truth, did write this about actually some 18 years ago or so. He wrote, "The hard way that facts are made up, that there is no such thing as natural, unmediated, unbiased access to truth, that we are always prisoners of language, that we are always speaking from a particular standpoint and so on, while dangerous extremists are using the very same arguments of social construction to destroy argument evidence that could save our lives." I mean, that's something that Latour has noticed, and somehow there's a kind of semi-mea culpa there at work. So that's just a question. To what extent have we been, or let's say our friends and even in some cases maybe intellectual heroes, been at work in actually contributing to truth decay? But here's the last thing I want to do is to say something, and this is a complicated story, and it's perhaps unfair to bring it up at the very end of this lecture, but I do want to say just 2 words about polarization. In the Rand report on truth decay, there's a discussion of polarization. They call it one of the drivers of truth decay. And what I am willing to say here, and we can explore it in the discussion if you like, I think polarization is a very loose term. It's very widely used. We hear endless talk about how our societies are more and more polarized. But actually, I think we need to be much more precise. Polarization means, if you're going to give it a precise definition, the clustering of preferences, policy, and beliefs around poles that are at some distance, or maybe even increasing distance from one another. And that should be distinguished from what we can call, in political science, called party sorting, which is the increasing identification of people, including, let's say, their beliefs, into two, in a bimodal way, so that they associate with parties. And that's very much what the Aiken and Bartel's book is about. And then there's a third idea, which both of these are separate from, which is the idea that the claim that various people's beliefs and preferences, in particular their policy choices about various different issues, are all aligned together. And just rather than going into any detail about this, I just want to quote one thing here, which is a summary really of findings that I think are pretty robust. And that is that most people, I mean, I'm talking about the American public, would prefer to divide their votes across different issues, were it possible. And most people are becoming more, would prefer to divide them across various different issues, not in a bimodal way, were it possible. And in fact, most people on one set of issues, moral issues, are becoming more liberal. So the empirical truth is that polarization names, I think, a superficial political fact. It's true of the partisans, it's true of the activists, it's true of people who are actively involved in politics, and above all true of representatives and senators. But there is a widespread belief that there is polarization, and that misperception is one that becomes real. It has real consequences, namely an increasing antagonism and distrust, and a sort of kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. The more we believe we're polarized, the more we are. So I'm going to conclude now with just a few sentences, a few thoughts. I want to conclude with a warning against polarization talk, because it involves a massive reduction of complexity and leads to stereotyping, from which it's all too easy to slip into the rhetoric of people living in different worlds, the limbo, in what Foucault calls regimes of truth. And from there, it's not a big jump to slide into a kind of Schmittian vision of fixed, irreconcilable opponents, each with their own truths, a vision of epistemic symmetry. And I think if you just want a single elevator takeaway from this talk, it's against epistemic symmetry. Because basically, practically and politically, I think we should just not think that way. Practically and politically, what this does is it argues against viewing adversaries as enemies. And it's also a reason not to reify them even as adversaries. For once we do that, we fail to see potential areas of engagement and transformation. So, last thought. Power can endanger truth. And power can endanger truth. It doesn't engender it. It endangers it, but it doesn't engender it. Hannah Arendt was right to say that truth and politics are in rather bad terms with one another, especially today. That's why I claim we must strenuously defend the fields, the Bourdieu-like fields of science journalism, the law, and public administration. For example, there are many examples. And we have to defend the norms within them, so that when functioning as they should, they protect truth from the power that can render truth impotent. So that's it.
Great, thank you, Stephen. So we do have time for questions. I will call on people. So Martha, please.
Yeah, you didn't mention Mill, because I guess he's not your guy, but
Oh, he is.
I think, well, he is in a way. I think there's something very profound about Mill's idea that truths need to constantly be tested by the most vigorous possible counter-arguments. And so where I would see a quite general danger among intellectuals, and I think we're all weak and we all like to flatter ourselves by hearing the things we like to hear, is in not seeking out the most vigorous contradictory views. You really have to work in a community even like this, which is all about contestation and skeptical challenges and so on, to arrange to have that actually happen and not to have the kind of lazy, and I think this is true of the left also, the lazy cliches parading as what's true. And so, but then the problem becomes that right now there are very few people who are responsible conservatives who are in the academy, because they don't like to be there. They're actually not treated very well when they're there and so on. And so there are one or two that always get called in. And so whenever I talk about same-sex marriage and I insist on having somebody debate it on the other side, there's always one person, David Novak from the University of Toronto, that get to come in. And here, I'm lucky to have the most wonderful colleague, Will Bode, and we teach together. And so, but, you know, this is rare to have someone with whom you can have a truly fundamental, challenging exchange and then expose the students to that. So do you have any thoughts about how to foster that? Maybe NYU has some insights into this that we could be helped by.
Well, I didn't want to suggest that we aren't in fact pretty tribal. We are.
Yeah.
But I still want to say that overall, there is a difference, and I did think it emerged very clearly on television this morning watching the congressional discussion, that one side is out to fight an enemy more or less at any cost. So that there was no engagement. I'm coming to a question in a minute.
Yeah.
But over that, which was the interrogation of whether Michael Cohen's testimony was to believe or not, the whole practice on the part of the Republicans was to discredit him. So it was he simply being treated as an enemy. There was no discussion of what was at issue. Now, but you're saying in the academy in particular, we're not sufficiently Johnson Mill-like because we don't have enough real contestation.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. It's something that I know some people, for instance, Jonathan Haidt is very concerned that in the social sciences there are so few right-wing people.
I think they go into industry or into other jobs because they're not treated very well when they're in the academy. I mean, this is, I say conservative, but I mean to include libertarians because those are really what we have. I mean, the two people that are on the right in this law school are the libertarians, not the conservatives. But anyway, to even get those people to come to consider an academic job, why would they consider it? They often feel, well, I'm going to be marginalized, and people would think I'm not au courant with the latest fashions and so forth.
Well, I don't know. You will know much more about this. I mean, I realize that speaking at the University of Chicago. I mean, I am speaking the place where, at least in the economics department, actually the lower economics department, there's no lack of what we could say is a right-wing set of opinions or theories.
Not as much
So
as
maybe you're not engaging enough with each other, but I don't feel. I mean, it seems to me there's it's certainly true that in various areas of the academy, there's a definite lack of John Stuart Mill-like contestation. I couldn't agree with you more about that. All we've got to do, you say, do I have any ideas about how to promote it? Wow. I know you just named something which I don't think we can do much about, namely the fact that young men especially are going into industry or into financially. I'm teaching a class at NYU now in which in social, actually it's on power and domination and resistance, and 13 out of the 15 students are women. I'm not sure what I can do about that. But because it's a fact partly about recruitment and where people are choosing to go. But if your general point is we are insufficiently contestatory in terms of
Yeah.
I completely agree. But it doesn't, I mean, doesn't touch the argument I was trying to make, does it? Which is that basically one side, as I see it, is actually out to treat the other as enemies. I don't believe that we are doing
But I kind of think in the academy, there, even in the philosophy department, let's forget about the English department,
Yeah.
that there's a tendency to treat anyone who's conservative or even libertarian as an enemy. I mean, we were recruiting candidates in the philosophy department one day, and I was describing at the dinner for this candidate the wonderful class I was teaching with Will Bode, where we had wonderful exchanges on public morality and legal conservatism. And my philosophy colleague said, "Don't worry, that never happens in the philosophy department." I was absolutely appalled that even in the philosophy department, they would think that to have this kind of argument and critical exchange was a bad thing.
There's no question it's a permanent temptation. I mean, in a way, what I'm trying to argue against is succumbing to it. I mean, I think I like this distinction between enemy and adversary, and we've just got to keep it alive.
Laura.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask whether you are ruling all structural critiques of the institutions and social fields that you're describing out of bounds. Because certainly there's a storied tradition of engaging in just the kind of critique that you're suggesting. As you know, we don't have to go to postmodernism to do that. We can talk about, to the namesake of this lecture, the famous Dewey-Lippmann debate, but we can also talk about critiques of the judiciary and classical legal thought as naturally entrenching certain norms that, of course, have power embedded within them and that are going to lead to outcomes that are inevitably slanted, et cetera. We can talk about critiques of the press, critiques of the courts, perhaps even science for the reasons you gave, that the role of money in science, we know there's been a long tradition of critiquing it for precisely that reason. And I guess what I'm wondering is whether there is any basis for distinguishing, in your view, between those kind of critiques and the critiques from the right that you're describing.
Well, I mean, I hope I'm aware of where your question is coming from. I certainly don't mean to rule out critiques of the law that stress all the ways in which the rule of law, the very phrase, should be put in question. I'm having a long-running debate with Bernard Harkle, who used to be here, on this very topic. I mean, there is a view, which is actually his, that it's all, in the end, comes down to power. Which Supreme Court justice was it said that the Constitution is whatever the Supreme Court says it is, something like that.
Well, Brennan said something about, it's a matter of 5 votes. I think it was Brennan.
So there is a kind of extreme version of this where you just say, it's all mystifying talk, and basically it can all be interpreted in power terms. And I am certainly resisting that. I don't think that, and as you mentioned science, I mean, there's a great deal said, and a lot of it very plausible about all the ways in which scientific procedure, scientific theorizing is, the claims about truth tracking and scientific progress are all the ways in which this can be, questioned and thought of as illusory. I mean, I accept all of this and think that a lot of the work along those directions is extremely important. But something has to be retained of great importance, which is that there is a way in which I claim all these 4 fields are truth tracking, and it's subject to endless danger and corruption and so on. But there's something that is irreducible.
Could I just actually follow up in one small way, which is I actually want to bracket. I think the example of science and even potentially the press is probably wrong because there it's a failure to abide by the norms of the field. But I actually think law is different because there's a deep critique that suggests that the entire, stretching back into the 19th, early 20th century that has suggested and has made some, and made for some important moments of progress by suggesting that the conception of rights or property that are embedded within law were fundamentally about power.
Yeah.
And that's a critique of the institution that is about the rules of the institution from within. And I guess, not to say whether it's right or not, but the question is that equally sort of epistemically, arbitrary or invalid because it challenges the norms of the discipline?
Well, I mean, these are hugely interesting questions. I think I pick up one word you used, which was equally. No. Clearly there are differences. I was putting them together before. And clearly, for example, the arguments of critical realism, just to take an example, are very powerful. I don't deny that. But nevertheless, I am resisting the kind of reduction which simply says its form is defined. I mean, I'm not sure how much further we can get on this discussion right now, but I mean, I recognize what you're saying, but I do want to say that the norms have some power independent of force independent of power in all cases, without taking the sort of, Habermasian view that it's just a matter of truth tracking and justification.
Yeah. Gentleman in the back row.
Just because you've mentioned a lot of figures that are very relevant to Horkheimer and Adorno, but you didn't mention them. And there was a piece written shortly after the election. I think it was in the Atlantic, but I can't remember. Trying to understand current events through the lens, of sort of ideas put forth in the dialectic of enlightenment.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to know to what degree you're sympathetic to the view that a lot of what's happening now is sort of inevitable given the way that the economy functions, together with the progress of technology, that sort of this was a storm in the waiting, and that until there's some sort of fundamental change in the way our economy is structured, that there's no way to contain sort of the forces, even with the institutions you've mentioned, because of the sort of inevitable, things that we know about how the economy functions.
That kind of economically driven fatalism is something I desperately try to avoid. I don't think that way. I mean, I really do think that there are ways of resisting these like in the foreseeable future. I suppose this is rather Dewey-like. I don't know. It seems to me that kind of doom-laden. I mean, Adorno and Horkheimer were real fatalists, revolutionary fatalists, and so I don't. Maybe it's temperamental, but I wouldn't. Why would you think? I mean, is it a technological or an economic? Is it economically driven? Both.
I think it's both. I think that they see what happened with the radio industry as happening again with social media. The people with this, the ability to make a profit off of it will inevitably drive us away from the truth. It's something like that. Even if they don't do it intentionally, there's these forces or what have you.
Well, if you're right, you're right. I mean, that view is right. It's right. But still, I think that there's still room, even if the catastrophe is driving towards this inevitability. There's still resistance is possible along the way. I mean, I'm encouraged, for example, by just yesterday by the fact that Brexit doesn't seem as though it can be. We can save.
Yes.
We can save my old country from disaster. So no, I'm not as doom-laden as that. No.
Please.
Against the notion that truth is respectable,
Yes.
there's a long-standing hero, the detective, who knows that people lie, and his mission is to find the truth by interrogating the suspects and getting beyond these respectable narrations. Now, there's another interesting example of this is in Jaworski's reply brief at Nixon against the United States, that the duty of the grand jury is to find the truth and the whole truth, that if there's a conspiracy, you name all the conspirators.
Right.
Now, this is not just institutional norms, this is really the idea that legitimate power is grounded in truth. And there's a long tradition of that. But to say that the essence of power is to be deceitful
Yeah.
this is really Machiavelli's term, and then Heidegger amplifies it. But it's really the common assumption by most people in the academy and in politics that Machiavelli is right. And just an example of, I would say, left deceit from the left is there was an article in the University of Chicago's Maroon saying that the GED, the graduate GRE, the graduate record exam, and the SAT don't really measure anything of any importance. Now, one could say that they do measure something of importance, and everybody should have the kind of education that would enable them to have what it does measure. But instead, because people who want to achieve more diversity want to say, well, it really doesn't measure anything. Now, I submit that that's an example of something that isn't strictly speaking true on the left. And of course, we can point to a multitude of statements on the right. But my point is really that it's the common assumption that we should say what advantages our political position or the result we want to bring. And as a result of that, everybody assumes they're being lied to. And so, long before Trump, there was no respect for the truth of the sort that you see in The Hero of the Detective and in the role of the grand jury as Jaworski laid it out. So it's a kind of corruption of a tradition which a proper conservatism would try to revive.
That's very interesting. I'm not sure what I have to say in response. I mean, I do think that there's a whole tradition of, which is as much left-wing as right-wing, I guess, of unmasking and debunking, which is very, very important to preserve, and which does rely, it does rely upon a kind of assumption that, you can, that behind appearances there lies something to be discovered. Unmasking, I make a distinction. Unmasking is figuring out what's going on behind appearances. Debunking is somehow showing that you're being fooled by the appearances. I think that it's terribly important to keep that tradition alive. I think you've given examples of it. But what I was really talking about the intellectuals whom we, I think, have to be worried about, are those who just discount and want to kind of destabilize the very idea of there being truth.
Woman there.
I'd like to ask you an autobiographical question, if I may. I'm young enough to have been in college and graduate school and went up in the early part of this century. And I remember in classes about theories of power, you were taught against Arendt.
Yes.
And it was sort of a teaching, or it's become sort of a teaching trope to use your work in contradistinction to Arendt's conception of power. And I wonder to what extent you think that's just a distilled version of something you wrote in the 60s, or whether you have come closer to an Arendtian conception of power that looks at, power as non-domination, power as action in concert, because, one implication of the question that you posed is that it isn't the essence of power to be deceitful, as she wanted us to think of it. And maybe the idea of that essay, I don't know, but maybe the idea of that essay was that the essence of, if we reconceived power away from domination, then perhaps we wouldn't think of things in terms of adversarial politics, but only agonistic politics.
Yeah. One thing I didn't say today, because it would have detracted from the argument that I was trying to make, she did actually, normally herself, use the concept of power, which was different. For her, power was acting in concert with others. She wanted to get away from this very idea when she wrote about power, for example, in her essay on violence and elsewhere. She wanted to say, we should stop thinking about power in this asymmetric way, it's controlling people. But I don't think that really solves any problems. You don't solve a deep problem in politics by redefining your terms. So I didn't talk about how Hannah Arendt, for the most part, thought about power. I think how she thought about it was somehow to, and it's striking to me about someone who's wrote so much about totalitarianism. She had a kind of rather benign idea, I think, about consensual politics. I wanted to attach power to that idea.
And the last question.
So let me see if I can restate your view. You'll tell me if I've got it right.
Oh, please do, yes.
It's less in terms precisely of truth, but truth will be connected. It almost sounds like a lament for the disappearance of a certain form of ideological argument. There are phrases, for instance, in the United States Constitution about we the people, the idea of promoting a general welfare, and a standard left-wing view of what an ideology does, Brian touched on this in our workshop a couple of days ago, is that it presents itself in the guise of promoting the general welfare. It does not present itself as simply in the interest of some smaller group.
Right.
And that has its uses for those who want to attack it because it's committed to the thought that it must defend itself in terms of how it promotes the general welfare.
Yeah.
If you have a president who simply, clearly thinks in terms of presenting things to a subset of the population, and if then that becomes part of the way in which political discourse goes, where you're not being, well, at least one group is not actually presenting its ideas in terms of how to promote the general welfare, but in terms, now this would be moves one form of adversarial into the other, but solely in terms of enemies and no notion of a we the people, then in fact there's not much of a sort of a foothold that one can have to say you're hostage to a truth claim about the general welfare. We can now try to explore and see if it stands up to scrutiny. Is that capturing something of what you're lamenting? Oddly enough, the absence of a certain kind of pretense of being concerned for the general welfare?
Well, I'm not advocating pretense.
No. But that the sort of degradation of the discourse has reached the point where that is lacking, because that at least allows you some basis on which to sort of try to push back.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, to put it in more sort of vernacular terms, I mean, my politics is kind of old-fashioned. I'm a social democrat and if you're saying I'm nostalgic for that, the answer is yes. But it's more than that. I mean, I'm actually trying to argue on two fronts. First of all, that we shouldn't discard and regard as over the idea that you can have a politics that is all-embracing, that is, in this sense, both liberal and social democratic. So what a Marxist might call class compromise, a certain kind of Marxism. But I'm also lamenting something else, I'm trying to contest something else, which is this idea of epistemic symmetry, which I think follows from the sort of Foucaultian idea that, and this is the topic of the talk really, I mean, that truth is a function of power, that power engenders truth rather than endangering it. That is, that we can think about all of us, let's say in contemporary America or in Britain, or come to think of it in Hungary or Poland, that where you get very sharply divided politics, really you can sort of step back and say, well, everybody's in their own epistemic world. I mean, I think there are, it's not just Rush Limbaugh, I think there are pressures at work that get people to think that way about themselves. And that's dangerous. That's what I was trying to get at the very end by saying we shouldn't be thinking that we're polarized, because we're not.